Hi, I'm Dr. Jay Varma, and welcome to Thermometer. On this channel, I check the temperature of health in the United States and around the world and give you expert insights on infectious diseases and public health. On today's episode, I'm diving into an infectious disease issue that touches on some hot button cultural and social issues. Could a parasite that's spread by cats be quietly contributing to a global crisis of male infertility? So, some of you may have heard of this parasite, Toxoplasma, before in the context of pregnant women, where they've been told to avoid changing the cat litter so that they don't get an infection that could damage their baby. Or maybe you heard about this in the context of the HIV epidemic, where it was a common and devastating cause of brain infections during the peak of the AIDS crisis in the United States, before the advent of highly effective therapy. But now we have news that this parasite might be more than just living rent-free in our brains. Emerging research suggests that it could be targeting the testes, damaging sperm, and potentially influencing birth rates. So to help us understand what we know, what we don't know, and what we should do now, I'm joined by Dr. Bill Sullivan, a professor of microbiology at Indiana University School of Medicine and the author of the book, Pleased to Meet Me: Genes, Germs, and the Curious Forces That Make Us Who We Are. Dr. Sullivan has been studying Toxoplasma gondii for years. His recent commentary and research have ignited conversations about whether male infertility could have an infectious disease origin. So together, we're going to talk about the science. What does it really show? What do we still don't know? And how this intersects with some of these broader issues that are out there, including the politics of masculinity and the real risks of scooping a litter box without any gloves. So, Bill, thank you very much for joining us today.
It's a pleasure to be here, Jay. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, absolutely. So why don't we start with a little bit of background about yourselves? What about yourself? Where do you work and what type of work do you do?
Sure. Well, I got my PhD from University of Pennsylvania way back in 1997, and that was in cell and molecular biology. But it was my graduate work that introduced me to this parasite that you mentioned, Toxoplasma gondii. And I've been working on this fascinating parasite ever since, now as a professor at Indiana University School of Medicine. Our current research is focused on developing a treatment for the persistent cyst form of the parasite. And we'll talk about that in a little more detail as we move forward. But there's no cure for that stage of the parasite, which is rather alarming.
Yeah. And so what actually got you started working on this? Was it just, a lot of people when they start their PhD, it's kind of like, I met a good PI and that was what they were working on. So that's how I got interested. Is that how you stumbled upon this, or was there some other inspiration that got you in this direction?
Well, when I started grad school, which was back in 1992, we were still at the height of the AIDS epidemic. And toxoplasmosis was one of the major killers of severely immunocompromised people suffering from AIDS. So it was getting a lot of traction in medical circles at the time, because prior to the AIDS pandemic, toxoplasma wasn't really discussed or researched all that much. And then when I learned that 1/3 of people around the world have this parasite in their brain, and there's no way to get rid of it, I became really intrigued. Toxo also infects just about every animal on the planet and changes their behavior. So I became a little obsessed with how this tiny parasite can have such a big impact on all of these creatures it infects, including humans. And I'm trying to figure out its mysteries and ultimately eradicate it from our bodies, where it can potentially do a lot of harm.
Yeah, that's fascinating. In fact, so, I think we're similar age. I started medical school in 1993. And at the time, we didn't have a highly effective therapy for HIV. So I saw lots and lots of patients in the hospital with severe brain infections. In fact, if you saw a young man come in with a seizure, you pretty much could guarantee that that was a person who had undiagnosed HIV and was now presenting with AIDS and Toxoplasma encephalitis effectively. And so, yeah, so it was a disease that I saw a lot during my medical training. And now, I practice 2 days a week doing clinical medicine, caring for people with HIV, and haven't seen a single case in a long time. So it is interesting how these diseases, other epidemics or infectious diseases will stimulate our interest in research. And so, but we've touched sort of skirted around the edges here of a little bit. Why don't you tell us a little bit more, educate all of us a little bit about how humans and other animals actually get infected with this parasite? And then you've alluded to the fact that it does, in fact, infect our brain. So how do people get infected? How does it then spread throughout our bodies?
Sure, that's a great question, because one of the statistics associated with this parasite is the astonishing seroprevalence. You're talking about billions of people all over the globe carrying this parasite in their brain. So how does it get into so many people? The answer to that question is because it has so many different routes of transmission. The most familiar one is through the cat, which you alluded to earlier. All feline species, when Toxoplasma infects them, it undergoes the sexual stage of its life cycle. Only does this in felines. But when that happens, the cat will excrete parasite eggs. We call them oocysts, and they're very sturdy and they last in the environment up to 1 or 2 years. And they can easily be picked up by accident by animals or humans, or even inhaled, according to some studies. So that is a major route of transmission. These oocysts that get into litter boxes, sandboxes, gardens, your yards. They also survive in the ocean and can get trapped in shellfish. So people who eat raw oysters, for example, could be inoculating themselves with a high dose of these parasite eggs. The second major route of transmission relates to the fact that when any animal becomes infected, this parasite never goes away. The immune system will control it rather quickly, but it will insist in brain and it insists in heart, as well as skeletal muscle. So if we don't cook meat properly and it carries these tissue cysts in its flesh, we become infected that way. And that is thought to be just as frequent as feline transmission. So undercooked meats is another major route of transmission. And then the final one, perhaps the most tragic, is mother-to-child transmission. And this occurs when a pregnant person becomes infected for the first time during their life. And when that happens, the parasite can cross the placental barrier and either cause miscarriage or congenital birth defects.
Yeah, and we know, anybody who has a person in their life who, other than your mom, maybe who's been pregnant, whether it's a wife, it's a sister, it's a friend, knows about the guidance, and especially if you've been pregnant yourself, of course, knows about the guidance to avoid changing cat litter when you're pregnant. So in my mind, that was always the link between, say, fertility and this parasite, right? Most of my training pretty much only heard of toxo in the context of, patients with advanced age with Toxoplasma brain infections, and in the context of pregnant women saying, avoid changing the cat litter. When my wife was pregnant with our kids and we had cats, I changed the cat litter for that reason. So how did you end up looking at this other aspect of fertility, which is the possibility that this parasite might have an impact on male fertility, not just on women who might infect their babies?
You're right. That is not a myth. It's not something that pregnant women say just to get out of this chore. There is a very real danger of pregnant women changing the litter box. Heed that advice. But yeah, this idea that Toxoplasma may have something to do with male fertility is relatively new. And a lot of the science here is preliminary, so we need to take that with a grain of salt. But the first hints that this might be a possibility, again, arose during the height of the AIDS pandemic, because there were several cases of testicular toxoplasmosis, which was almost unheard of in the years prior. And that raised the question about fertility. If we now have evidence that the parasite can disseminate to the testes, it raises questions about fertility. Now, my colleagues and I did a study in 2017 that showed Toxoplasma can insist in a mouse prostate and may be linked to the inflammation of the prostate, which, as you know, is a precursor to prostate cancer. But we were not part of the study linking toxo to fertility. That was conducted by a talented team of researchers from Germany, Uruguay, and Chile, a huge collaborative effort, but it was predicated on this preliminary data from the clinic as well as basic science labs that Toxoplasma can infiltrate the testes. So maybe there's a connection with male fertility.
Oh, so it's interesting, in terms of all these connections that get formed that were originally looking at potentially in the prostate and then in the testes themselves. And it looks like, some of the other research that you highlighted in your recent article about this topic was not only can it form this cyst form in the prostate and the testes, which are all part of the male reproductive system, but they may actually have a direct toxoplasma toxic effect on the sperm themselves. Can you walk us through what might be happening kind of at the cellular and molecular level?
Yeah, absolutely. Prior to this study, some animal studies were conducted, and it was found that toxo can infect the testes of mice within 48 hours post-infection. So it not only goes to the testes and male reproductive organs, but it goes there quickly. Cysts can be found in the testes of infected mice as well. And the new study showed that Toxoplasma can also access the epididymis in mice. And this is a tube canal where sperm mature and then they're stored. So this prompted the researchers to see what happens if you put Toxoplasma parasites in direct contact with sperm. And they used human sperm for this experiment. And it was all done in a test tube. Pretty simple to do. And it's a little surprising that no one's done it before, given the fact that we know that the parasite can infiltrate male reproductive organs. The results were something out of a nightmare. Within a few minutes, and the pictures really speak 1,000 words here. I encourage you to go to the conversation article or the actual publication and look at these rather disturbing pictures. But within just a few minutes, nearly 25% of the human sperm that were exposed to Toxoplasma literally lost their heads. The head of the sperm popped right off. And other sperm that maintained their head were still misshapen, or they had holes in their head as if the parasite was trying to invade that sperm cell like it would any other type of cell.
So that's a really dramatic description, right? And I think anybody who is a man out there, or anybody who has sperm, immediately probably recoils, thinking about the concept that their sperm could be beheaded or about to be invaded, almost zombie-like, by a parasite. So do we know anything about this damage? Presumably, this sounds like it would be irreversible if it occurred, at least in particular, to the sperm that were exposed. And do we know anything about, whether sperm could potentially recover from this type of damage?
Well, just like you alluded to, I don't think there's any way for a beheaded sperm to reattach its head. Yeah. And I suspect that the other type of damage, like holes in the sperm head or bent tails, that's also unlikely to be reversible. So yeah, game over, I think. And it's important to add, though, that Toxoplasma probably doesn't damage every sperm, so all hope might not be lost. But I do think that fertility may diminish, perhaps not entirely, but it's not good news.
And what about, so obviously the next thing that I would worry about, of course, is that if in fact you have Toxoplasma infection in a human male and it's potentially infecting their prostate, it's in their testes, it's in their epididymis, so it's throughout the sort of male reproductive system, that you could then potentially get sexual transmission via semen. Is there any reason for us to be worried about Toxoplasma being transmissible via human male semen?
Yeah, that's a tantalizing possibility, and you're not the first to propose it. There are some investigators in our field who have thought the same thing. They hypothesized that there could be an avenue for sexual transmission for Toxoplasma. And whether that is through the acute stage of infection when the parasites are actively replicating in the body versus chronic, where they're just encysted, still has to be sorted out. It remains a controversial idea at present. But some studies do suggest it's possible. It's not believed to be a major route of transmission like the other three that we've mentioned. People don't have active toxoplasmosis for a long period of time unless they're severely immune compromised. And that's when you might see live parasites in semen that could be sexually transmitted. In
Yeah,
most
but
cases, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
no, go ahead. No, I mean, I think the reason it's interesting to me and potentially possible is that we've just been learning so much more about the sexual transmission possibilities of emerging infectious diseases. There's a number of viral infections that we as infectious disease public health people never believed to have any potential sexual route whatsoever. But now in the past 10, 15 years, we've learned about sexual transmission of Ebola virus. These become restricted spaces and men can transmit it to others. We've learned about vector-borne infections like Zika virus, and now Pooch virus, which can, a human gets bitten, they get this infection that eventually spreads to their reproductive tract, and it's a danger for men. Again, historically, we've looked at infectious diseases and worried about what happens to a woman that is pregnant and gets infected. But now we do need to be concerned about these possibilities. So anyway, that's why I do think obviously parasitic infections are very different life cycle, a very different behavior, but it is this area, I think, that is, obviously legitimately worth exploring further.
Yeah, I think those are great points. And science is always learning new things and surprising things. So who knows? We may be taking it for granted right now that Toxoplasma is not sexually transmitted, but with further research, we may find out that maybe at least for a time during acute infection, there is that possibility. So yeah, time and more research will tell.
Yep. And so most of the research that has been done on Toxoplasma's impact on fertility, outside of the study that you described that's done in a laboratory on male sperm, on human sperm, most of this research has been done in animal models. So what's the strongest evidence that you believe we have today that Toxoplasma can harm male fertility? What do we know from these animal studies? And then after that, I'm going to get into questions about what we know from the human studies.
Sure. Well, at the moment, we can only infer impacts on fertility, but it does seem clear that Toxoplasma can affect sperm quality. So it's a reasonable hypothesis. Sperm production has been found to be diminished in Toxoplasma infected mice, in infected rats, and infected rams. So multiple different species of animal, the same phenomena has been observed. Infected mice also have significantly lower sperm counts and a higher proportion of abnormally shaped sperm, very similar to what these investigators elucidated in the current study when they looked at damaged sperm under the microscope following interaction with Toxoplasma. So again, we don't have direct tests on male fertility, but given the damage the parasite seems capable of inflicting on sperm, I think it warrants closer investigation.
And so then what do we know about studies that have been done in humans? What do the data show us so far?
There hasn't been much work done to address that question, but there are a couple intriguing preliminary studies. For example, in 2005, there was a small study in China that found sterile men are more likely to test positive for Toxoplasma than fertile men. Correlation, but it tracks with this evidence. And in 2021, another small study done in Czechoslovakia of about 150 men, all infected with Toxoplasma, found that 86% of them had semen anomalies. So that's rather striking and again, consistent with this new study. Do want to interject, however, that not all studies have revealed this connection. There was a small study done in Romania a few years ago that didn't find a link between toxoplasmosis and human sperm quality.
So obviously we need to know more about what the impact might be actual on humans themselves. Obviously, there's so many things that we can do in mice. We can basically cure cancer in mice, but it's always helps us with inference and what might happen in humans, but it's not definitive, right? What do you think a definitive human study would look like? What kind of prospective large scale research would make you feel confident saying, hey, Toxoplasma is really a risk for male infertility in humans?
Yeah, that is not trivial to investigate. The easiest thing to do would be to look at these animal models because we can set up really well controlled and defined and longitudinal studies to see if fertility drops. But I totally agree with you. You ultimately need to do observations in humans to really nail that point home. We also need more evidence that men infected with Toxoplasma have damaged sperm, and that is something we can do in humans. And to what extent is it damaged? Studies to date are just too small to draw firm conclusions. I agree that larger studies of infertile couples could try to assess whether the man is infected with Toxoplasma, and then we can build up stronger cases. Even though they're correlative, we have more evidence to suggest that this link is real.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the scientific or medical questions I would worry about or wonder about is, in my experience, and I haven't looked into this, I'm curious if assuming you know the answer, but the only assay that we've ever used for Toxoplasma is essentially a serologic study. Do you have presence of an antibody to Toxoplasma as evidence that obviously that's evidence you've been exposed, but we use that as an inference to, because you've been exposed, therefore you almost certainly have it resident in your body somewhere. Do we have other assays that can be used in humans that give a better indication of whether this is not just simply exposure in the past, but actually the presence of cysts in your body themselves?
Not at the moment, but you're absolutely right. There is a good blood test that can tell you, it can give you a readout for both IgG and IgM, two different types of antibody that can suggest whether you have an active infection or if you've been infected in the past and still carry the parasite in your body somewhere. Now, that blood test has evolved by leaps and bounds. And today there is a test being developed at University of Chicago by Dr. Rima McLeod that is a simple pinprick and can very easily and cheaply discern whether someone has been infected with toxoplasmosis. I'm also aware that there's a saliva-based test under development, but I haven't seen any publications on that. Might be something to be on the lookout for down the road.
Yeah, because obviously the easier you make the potential diagnosis, the more readily you could potentially conduct studies in humans
Absolutely.
to look at these questions, whether it's maybe, I mean, I could just off the top of my head think of, like, you would assume that sperm banks, where men go to donate sperm, this would be the perfect opportunity to evaluate, because men are giving sperm. I'm assuming sperm banks assess the quality of the sperm to ensure that these sperm are motile and potentially fertile. So yeah, that would be obviously be one situation in which you could at least look at the correlation between Toxoplasma seroprevalence and male sperm abnormalities.
Right.
What do you think, so now looking back, sort of, panning out a little bit about this, there is a lot of concern about male fertility globally. There have been, we're seeing this, incredible political activism occurring under, being led by RFK, kind of identifying, various, quote, toxins out in the world, everything from, chemical agents used in industrial production or in food, or even electromagnetism, and blaming all of these on the potential crisis in male fertility. Now, people like yourself and mine who have a passion and an interest in infectious diseases also want to look at the possibility of infections as a cause. And we know in women, of course, and in men, that common bacterial infections like gonorrhea and chlamydia can lead to infertility. What potential role do you think there is? Like, how big a role, if you had to guess, do you think Toxoplasma might play in this male fertility crisis?
Good question. Male infertility rates increased nearly 80% from 1990 to 2019. So the reasons driving this alarming trend, they remain a mystery, but the frequently cited culprits include obesity, poor diet, environmental toxins, and there's evidence for all of those possibilities. And of course, it's not perhaps just one thing. Mm-hmm. But I agree with you that infectious disease can also play a role, and these tend to be underappreciated dangers. Toxoplasma may soon join the ranks of gonorrhea and chlamydia as overlooked factors in the male infertility puzzle. Another caveat is that Toxoplasma rates, seroprevalence rates, are coming down in the most high-income countries, but infertility continues to rise. So Toxoplasma is probably not the main culprit, but could still be an important factor for some men. The prudent thing to do would be to avoid getting infected in the first place.
So, what are some practical things that humans, but especially men, or people with male reproductive tracts, should be doing to lower their risk of Toxoplasma exposure? Should they avoid cats? Should they avoid undercooked meat? I mean, I generally, as somebody who spent much of my career working on food safety, I like my meat well cooked, but I know most people don't. So, what would be your practical recommendations?
Yeah, I'll be happy to share those. And we certainly do not need to get rid of cats, but that is one of the most common questions I get whenever I talk about Toxoplasma and tell people they can catch it from cat feces. So it's a legitimate concern. But these remarks should also be prefaced, Jay, with the possibility that Toxoplasma is indeed a brain parasite. So
Yeah.
that should also further incentivize people to avoid catching this parasite in the first place.
Yeah.
We don't know exactly all the things it does once it's in the brain, especially in a normal, healthy person, but there is evidence of personality and behavioral changes, some of which can be very dangerous, high risk taking, impulsive behavior, and so on. So how do we avoid it? Well, you don't need to get rid of your cat, but you do need to take care of your cat properly. Promptly cleaning the litter box helps a lot because these Toxoplasma eggs need about 24 hours to mature after they hit the air. So if you clean the litter box promptly and thoroughly wash your hands afterwards, that's going to greatly minimize transmission from the cat. If your cat is a household cat and never hunts outdoors, and you never feed it raw meat, even better. You should also be mindful to wash fruits and vegetables. As I said, oocysts can be out there in farms and in your garden, and they can be left on fruits and vegetables. So you need to wash them thoroughly. As we said earlier, you need to cook meat to the proper temperature and avoid raw shellfish as well as raw water and raw milk. If you do all of those things, the chances of you acquiring Toxoplasma is pretty minimal.
Yeah, and one of the things that I'm curious about is, is there any world, and I mean, obviously we need better data on this, but your insight into this, is there a world in which empiric treatment would make sense for certain people or certain populations? Pyrimethamine, sulfadiazine, Septra, or the other treatments that, again, I haven't used in decades because I haven't had patients with advanced AIDS, because so many of them are on effective treatment. Is that something you would ever consider for? I don't know if you have, you yourself are seeking to have children, or you have children in your life that may be having children themselves. Is that something you'd ever recommend to men?
Well, those are also really great questions. With the rise of really high quality antiretrovirals, HIV has become much more manageable, and that has allowed the immune system to remain strong, which greatly curtails Toxoplasma from reactivating in HIV positive patients. But there are still circumstances where maybe prophylactic treatment would be warranted. People undergoing organ transplantation, for example, they are usually medicinally immunosuppressed to prevent organ rejection. If they are infected with Toxoplasma, that could reactivate the infection at a time when that patient is very vulnerable.
Yeah.
And in fact, there are studies that have been done that have heart transplants in particular are complicated 10 to 14% because of reactivated toxoplasmosis. If those patients were given prophylactics like the antifolates that you mentioned, that would be a good thing. We certainly don't want to put antifolates into pregnant people if we can avoid that. On the contrary, we usually supplement with folate just as an added precaution because we know it is good for the developing fetus. In Europe, however, there are antibiotics that can be given that prevent transmission of Toxoplasma from mother to child, but these antibiotics do not cross the placenta, so they will leave the fetus alone. So if the parasite has not made its way across the placenta yet, antibiotics like spearmycin can be extremely valuable in preventing mother to child transmission. Unfortunately, and rather surprisingly, in the United States, we do not test. We don't monitor people while they're pregnant to see if they become infected with Toxoplasma. Other countries do this. France, for example, Brazil does it. But we do not, and that's always struck me as a little bit peculiar, because our seroprevalence rates are not as high as some other countries, but we still have an incidence of anywhere between 400 and 4,000 cases of congenital infection every year. And if a testing program can be economically done, it seems to be a very sensible thing to do. With respect to men taking prophylactic drugs, I think you certainly don't want to go on medications, because all of these drugs that you mentioned do have side effects. Especially the antifolates. Those side effects can be downright toxic after prolonged periods of time. So I think the best course of action is preventative medicine, not in the form of a chemical or a drug, but in the form of hygiene.
Yeah, and so I think that's an absolutely critical and important message. I mean, as a clinician and as a public health person, as somebody who's worked a lot on antimicrobial resistance, I think it's really critical to emphasize that point here, that this is all preliminary work. It's important hypotheses that need to be tested. There are some important preventive measures that just make sense generally, but starting antimicrobial treatment to potentially benefit your fertility is not the recommendation at this point, given the potential toxicity and really the lack of really strong evidence yet that treatment would actually benefit you in some way.
Yeah, agreed. It's not time to panic or jump to conclusions. It's an intriguing series of studies, but as we've seen many times in the history of science, as compelling as the initial data might look, with further study, it just doesn't hold up. So I think we need a little time and patience, and of course, research dollars, so we can nail down whether this is an actual possibility or not.
Yeah, and I can't help but comment on sort of the cultural and political moment that we're in, and we saw during this past election the current vice president mocking cat ladies for being single, and also being worried about a crisis of fertility and birth, particularly male virility, men having partners, men's sperm counts going down, and a lot of those cultural forces that are mocking cat ladies and talking about a fertility crisis and trying to promote, more fertile families. There's now kind of a weird, curious link, right? Like the sperm, your sperm could theoretically be under siege from cats, not from cat ladies. I wonder if that irony has struck you the way it struck me.
The similar thoughts have crossed my mind, and there's a really there's a tendency to be very short-sighted with this and blame victims for things that are completely outside of their control. Yeah. But at the same time, you're talking about all of this out of one side of your mouth, and at the other side of your mouth, you're cutting research dollars. In the case of NIH, up to 44%, yeah, which is just going to devastate our ability in America to do this basic science and translate it into clinical outputs. So this is not a time where you want to diminish research funding. If anything, it needs to be increased, because it's been chronically underfunded for a couple decades now, and other countries in the world are surpassing the US as leaders in biomedicine.
Yeah, this is absolutely critically important. I think there's a bigger issue of this sort of anti-science forces, but those anti-science and anti-germ theory, unfortunately, forces are resulting in us gutting our public health programs, everything from healthcare delivery to primary prevention, and to the engine of U.S. economic growth and success over the past 50 or 60 years was the investment in universities, and particularly in the areas of scientific research. So I think that if anybody who's out there who really cares about health, both development of new advances in health, as well as getting more equity and distribution of current health services, needs to be interested and concerned about these issues. And so I really appreciate you joining me today, because it's just yet another example of all of the important things that we have still to learn, and the ways in which some of the conditions that people are very actively concerned about, how there is a very clear link to us continuing our scientific research, continuing our medical work, so that we can address these problems that some people view entirely as culturally, when in fact there may be sort of a biological or infectious origin to them.
Yeah, absolutely. And my hat's off to you, Jay, for creating this platform and trying to get the message out there, getting evidence-based research out to people in a balanced fashion. and countering this gross anti-science and anti-medicine movement that is creating this perfect storm that is driving down research dollars and fostering misguided mistrust in health authorities.
Yep, absolutely. So thank you very much, Dr. Sullivan, for joining me today. And for those of you out there, if you like learning about public health and infectious diseases, you want to learn about all the interesting ways in which our microbial world interacts with our bodies, please hit the like button. Please comment. Please share this episode. And most importantly, hit subscribe. And we'll see you back again for another episode of Thermometer. Have a good day.